I am super excited to get to our comparisons of the different color modes in a bunch of Game Boy games, but first, real quick here, this episode of My Life in Gaming is of course sponsored by Factor. Listen, I don't get much joy from cooking, so I've been a Factor subscriber for the past 2 years, well before they sponsored our show, by the way. Fresh, never frozen meals that I could microwave in a couple of minutes were a perfect fit for me. And listen up, because the offer's a bit different this time. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code MLiG50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. And you know, I'd take advantage of that savings and try some of the goodies beyond the main meals, like these mango smoothies. So yeah, that's code MLiG50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month of orders. I've long believed that limitations are a boon to creativity, and the monochromatic original Game Boy screen led designers to create games and imagery that remain striking to this day. But technology always seeks to remove limitations, or offer a different set of limitations. So when the Super Game Boy for Super Nintendo came along in 1994, its most marketable selling point was adding a bit of color to Game Boy games. And of course, in 1998, the Game Boy Color ushered in an era of full-color games made especially for the hardware. But then there are the black carts. I'm sure you already know that these can play on any old Game Boy, but also take advantage of the Game Boy Color, while even offering some largely overlooked Super Game Boy support in many cases. But here's the thing. Visual differences between the Game Boy and Game Boy Color versions within these carts don't always just amount to swapping shades for colors and vice versa. I mean, as many times as you've played Link's Awakening, did you ever notice that things like the short grass tile set are a totally different design between Game Boy and Game Boy Color? I say all this to say, I suspect that most of us are guilty of almost always defaulting to the Game Boy Color version of these games. It's the better system after all, so why wouldn't we play them that way? But I think the artistry across the methods of play, Game Boy, Super Game Boy, and Game Boy Color, are all equally deserving of being seen and appreciated. So I thought it would be fun to look at a bunch of these multi-mode Game Boy games so that we can all judge for ourselves whether or not color really is always better. So first, I'm going to use a couple of games that I already featured in our recent episode on video game compilations to illustrate the kinds of things that we're looking at in this episode. In fact, some of the things I noticed in those games reminded me that this is something I'd been wanting to look at more closely for a while, just to sate my own curiosity. Game & Watch Gallery 2 and 3 are possibly the best overall examples of what I'm talking about. Games where the monochrome and color modes have artwork that do not match one-to-one, while also having surprisingly robust Super Game Boy support. In the Parachute game, for instance, a lot of things look different, particularly the castle in the background. I'd say it looks great in both versions, but something I think the original Game Boy is particularly good at is displaying minimalist backgrounds in a way that feels like they're actually far off into the distance, fading into the fog or natural haze of the atmosphere, which lets your imagination fill much more into the gaps between the sparse pixels. It's neat, right? You'll see lots of differences of this nature throughout Game & Watch Gallery 2 and 3. In general, the artwork seems to be designed differently to play to the strengths of each system. But in other cases, like in the Chef game, well, I don't particularly have anything against dithering like some people do, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the tiled flooring looks much nicer on the Game Boy Color. On the flip side, who wants to eat the cookies rolling down this volcanic mountainside? Ugh. Apparently Yoshi does, but on the original Game Boy, the setting is radically different. It looks much more like something that I could believe is a cookie factory. Or how about this? In the Vermin game, the dark orange Yoshi on GBC doesn't really do it for me, whereas the Super Game Boy presentation, based on the assets from the monochrome version, has a green Yoshi with nice bright yellow spotted eggs. And in this case, I personally think that the trees and gradient dither pattern on the ground in that version looks more interesting than the GBC's zigzag motifs. Super Game Boy is generally treated very well across the various modes in the Game & Watch Gallery collections, including borders styled after the original handheld games when booting up the classic modes. Not to mention, the Super Game Boy palettes in the classic modes are extremely comparable to the Game Boy Color presentation, which is pretty impressive, I think. Or in the case of another set of games that I covered in that compilations episode, the Konami GB Collection series, the games were absolutely not designed for color at all, many of them originally being quite early Game Boy titles. Some of the Game Boy Color modes, which are exclusive to the European releases, look close enough to something that you could believe was designed from the beginning with the GBC in mind. But many of the other games, while neat, have a hard time shaking the impression that they were just never meant to be seen in anything other than 4 shades. The colorized Probotector, Operation C as we know it here in North America, has some of the best examples of the issues that we'll be keeping an eye out for in other games throughout this episode. Because the background is a different color from the mountainside, you get this stair-step palette issue alongside the rocky slope. And the trees on the original Game Boy do that thing I talked about earlier where you get the impression of a hazy, humid jungle atmosphere, whereas they look like a page from a preschooler's coloring book on Game Boy Color. All due respect to the devs though, I mean, these assets weren't meant for this. Similar artifacts, where the borders of palettes assigned to the background tiles don't blend as naturally as you'd hope, will be seen quite a few times throughout this episode. By the way, commenters brought to my attention that while the GBC support is exclusive to the European versions of these Konami collections, they lack Super Game Boy features. However, the regular Game Boy copies that were released in Japan, the only other region that got them, do have Super Game Boy borders and palettes. So now I'm honestly torn as to which region's carts are more desirable. This isn't the video for getting into the specifics of how each Game Boy system pulls this off, but it all comes down to the limitations of each and the priority placed on that hardware during development of a black cart game, in addition to the design of the game and whether the monochromatic or color implementation is in harmony with that design. So let's get properly into it. In that same video game compilations episode, I featured some packages that include multiple Dragon Quest games. And while I wasn't necessarily trying to be exhaustively comprehensive, the black Game Boy cartridge of Dragon Quest 1 and 2, or rather Dragon Warrior 1 and 2, admittedly didn't cross my mind for inclusion at the time. Obviously, I don't have time to play deep into these versions right now, but first impressions are good. Both games open with story sequences featuring artwork that is very attractive on Game Boy, Super Game Boy, and Game Boy Color. The sky gradient in this dramatic shot is a nice touch on Game Boy Color, although if I were to pick one variant to hang on my wall, I'd honestly have a hard time choosing. I could see the weathered vibe of the Super Game Boy palette not being to everyone's taste, but it immediately reminded me of the Famicom box and cartridge art for Dragon Quest III. I wonder if that's intentional. The game switches things up in combat with orange hues, which, for better or worse, makes it feel like battles are always at sunset. Like the original Famicom and NES versions though, the single monster fights against various backdrops in Dragon Warrior 1 are traded in for multi-monster fights in Dragon Warrior 2 with no backgrounds. Super Game Boy features also include the most elaborate use of borders that I have ever come across. They change on the fly between locations like castles, towns, and the overworld to suit the scene. As for the Game Boy Color support, it's solid, but not exceptional. I was really hoping that there might be added detail in the empty middle sections of Dragon Warrior 1's battle screens, or maybe backgrounds at all in Dragon Warrior 2 battles, but alas, there are not. sprites and tiles between Game Boy and Game Boy Color versions appear to be generally identical. The hero of Dragon Warrior 2 has two annoying pixels on his head that flash on and off between left-facing poses. A mistake, I assume, and I checked to make sure it happens on both Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and yes, it does, but not when you face any other direction. In towns, scrolling can be a bit unsmooth on both Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Some games do engage the GBC's double-speed CPU mode, but seemingly not this one. However, it's certainly nothing too egregious compared to the atrociously choppy Switch ports of the mobile versions. The colors on GBC are good enough overall, but I can't help but feel that if you want to play these versions, why not just lean all the way into the DMG Game Boy-ness of it all, since the colorization can't compete with the NES and Super Famicom versions anyway. I can definitely see the appeal of playing these games in this style. Wario Land II initially released in Western markets earlier in 1998 as a regular Game Boy game, but it launched alongside the Game Boy Color in Japan and was also later reissued in other markets with GBC support. That said, I can't help but feel that the colorization looks a bit sloppy and that the Super Game Boy support is more satisfying. First off, we can see a lot of problems right here. The tips of the grass are blue or gray when overlapping with water or rock. And as Wario bobs up and down, you might spot on his falling pose that there's just a single pixel hole by the button of his overalls that shows the background color straight through it. This would be easy to not notice in monochrome, but here you can see it with every jump he makes. And look here how the columns appear to be just floating above the grass. Well, to be fair, it was an effective visual shortcut for original Game Boy. I passed it by without giving it a thought. I don't think the background artist ever meant for the columns or mountains to stick out the way they do with color. I originally played Wario Land II before it was colorized, and while it's one of the most iconic dual-mode carts, some of the background tile design wasn't a great fit for it. I will say one nice thing though. Game Boy Color definitely has less slowdown in places where regular Game Boy buckles. Wario Land 2 does of course have a Super Game Boy border and palettes that change from level to level. If you want to play with some amount of color, I think this is the way to go. If you want a good example of what music can do for a video game, compare any version of Tetris to Tetris DX. Sure, Tetris is Tetris, but this version of Tetris is nonetheless hugely disappointing, and it's all because of the music. That is not what anyone wants to hear when they play Tetris, especially not on Game Boy. Anyway, the title screen here has a diagonally scrolling checkerboard pattern, but just to flex a bit, there's an extra layer of shading over it on Game Boy Color. However, the DX text is pure white. Whereas on original Game Boy, there's an inner drop shadow giving it some depth. During gameplay on Game Boy Color, similar grid patterns decorate the margins of the screen by scrolling or rotating in various ways. But this space is left undecorated on original Game Boy. Perhaps the most useless, yet most interesting GBC flourish in Tetris DX is that various non-interactive tech demos appear between gameplay demos if you just let the system sit on the title screen. These do not appear at all on regular Game Boy. The one with the fish is probably my favorite thing in this version of Tetris. Rounding off my profound disappointment is the total lack of Super Game Boy palette support. However, weirdly, there is rather unique border support in that the border is different depending on what hardware it's running on, Super Game Boy or Super Game Boy 2. I guess the Super Game Boy 2 was kinda new in Japan at the time, but why bother with this and not a palette, I wonder? It's just a wild guess, but maybe palette swapping could cause sync issues with multiplayer on the new Link port? I've always been an ardent apologist for Quest 64. I mean, sure, measured against the standards set by Final Fantasy VII and other epic cinematic CD-based RPGs, it was the wrong game at the wrong time. Something for N64 haters to point and laugh at, and for N64 fans to take as an insult. But taken on its own merits, it's got a cool elemental leveling up system, somewhat unique combat, and I think it's kinda charming how it has no cutscenes, only gameplay. It's basically an NES RPG, and there ain't a thing in the world wrong with that. Well, maybe Quest 64 fits better on an 8-bit system then. That's pretty much exactly what Quest, Brian's Journey is. Quest 64 on the Game Boy. The story and gameplay seem to be almost exactly the same. And I have to admit, I really wanted to keep playing even after I'd recorded more than enough footage. I can definitely get behind a good basic JRPG, and my first impressions are that in spite of its simplicity and poor writing, it moves along quickly and I enjoy leveling up the elemental powers. Visually, the game does work well enough on Game Boy, but believe it or not, this is among the best Game Boy Color implementations I tested for this episode. Awkwardly colored tiling is nearly non-existent, with this example of the background behind the columns outside Melroad Monastery being the one egregious example I spotted in my playtime thus far. Unfortunately, dithered shading used in various places here and there doesn't become solid color on GBC either. But there are a few spots of minor additional detail, such as in the elemental emblem on the floor here, and the candles, which use the same shade for the wax and flame in the monochrome presentation. These certainly look a bit more proper in color. A very striking example of how color can result in better artwork can be seen in the forest battle scenes, where on Game Boy Color, it becomes apparent that the top half of the screen is covered by the shadow of the tree canopy. Before seeing it in color, it didn't make that impression to me at all. The game even runs a bit better on Game Boy Color, with smoother scrolling and less slowdown, which can impact the music in the original Game Boy mode at times. Admittedly, the music is mostly just recycled from Quest 64 and is not exactly the best use of Game Boy sound hardware that I've ever heard. Unfortunately, there seems to be no Super Game Boy support here. Even though it is unambitious, Brian's Journey doesn't particularly fail at anything it's set out to do either. It's a very competently made Black Cart title that is good on any Game Boy, but especially on Game Boy Color, and I look forward to playing more. There is another Quest-themed Black Cart, but this one is not what you'd expect. Quest Fantasy Challenge is either a Mr. Do clone or an unofficial but rebranded Mr. Do. It's hard to piece together the truth of it. Either way, there is a much older version of Mr. Do for the Game Boy that is also much more impressive. Great animation, sound, and smooth scrolling. Quest Fantasy Challenge has unremarkable animation, not great music, and no scrolling. And instead of a clown digging through the dirt, you're everyone's favorite RPG hero, Brian, digging through the dirt. There's not much to the visuals no matter how you play it, but it does look better in color, I'd say, and at least the colors change up between levels. Although what's up with this one monster who was a snake lady while pushing the treasure to the right, but then became a scorpion like the other enemies when she turned around? Ultimately, the game is fine, I guess, but likely won't satisfy Mr. Do diehards or Quest 64 defenders, and will just confuse everyone else as to why it exists. It'll especially confuse European players where the title is exactly the same as the proper Quest 64 RPG over there, Holy Magic Century, as reflected in the Super Game Boy border. You'd think that that would be the European title of Brian's Journey, but Europe seemingly didn't get that one. The American Super Game Boy border uses the Quest title instead. The supposedly custom Super Game Boy palette is just black and white. What a cop-out. I want to finish up here with some games by Rare. It's no secret that Conker started out as yet another cute and family-friendly animal character before Rare rebooted development on his main N64 game to become the famously vulgar string of parodies that was released as Conker's Bad Fur Day in 2001. It is completely different from the family-friendly Game Boy game, Conker's Pocket Tales, which snuck out the door in 1999 before the 2001 N64 game's change in tone, or at least before that change was known publicly. But you know what else is completely different? Conker's Pocket Tales when played on a Game Boy versus a Game Boy Color. The differences are immediately apparent, with different Nintendo and Rareware logo sequences, followed by significantly different title sequences. On Game Boy Color, the screen scrolls down, the clouds part, and Conker's house is revealed in a bucolic setting. Ugh, that's the first time I ever tried using that word, and I don't think I'll ever do that again. Meanwhile, on original Game Boy, the logo has a bit more depth and chiseled texture compared to GBC. But then, it gives way to a horrifying, screen-filling, disembodied Conker head eerily following a butterfly with his eyes. Which, by the way, have blue irises on Super Game Boy. The butterfly's animation is impressive though. Also note that the save data is not compatible between Game Boy and Game Boy Color. The opening cutscene where an evil acorn, named Evil Acorn, ruins Conker's birthday party and kidnaps Barry has additional animation on Game Boy Color, although with a bizarre large gray tiled region in this one shot, and even an extra shot of Conker crying that's not on Game Boy at all. Afterwards, you'll notice that text is considerably larger on Game Boy Color, which isn't great because the GBC version always takes a lot more text boxes to convey the same information. And then, what? Conker's house isn't even remotely the same and has 2 rooms on Game Boy Color. Head outside and yeah, like I've been saying, this is not the same game. Also notice that a HUD with health and slingshot ammunition is always visible on Game Boy, but not Game Boy Color. Instead, an adaptive HUD appears when collecting nuts that briefly shows your health and ammo, and I actually found this to be a bit annoying. Whether due to my health being out of sight, out of mind, or enemies just being more aggressive somehow, I found myself dying a lot more in the Game Boy Color version. You can save at any time on GBC though, as opposed to only being able to save at scattered save points on original Game Boy. Although personally, I think that save points are a good and underappreciated game design tool in general. The overall world layout and order of event triggers is broadly similar between systems from what I've played, but the pathways are not the same, and interior layouts and puzzles are considerably different. Check it out, these bridges on Game Boy Color? I never saw anything equivalent on Game Boy. And here in the spooky forest, this sign indicates different directions for the Claw Swamp and Forest Wong. That's an Old English word for meadow apparently. Even how Conker moves boxes is different. He moves as he pushes them on Game Boy, but they slide on their own after one push on Game Boy Color. I think that one reason that the game is more frustrating on Game Boy Color is that here, the camera locks firmly onto Conker in the center of the screen. But on Game Boy, the positioning adapts depending on what direction you're moving, which means that you have more visibility on enemies that are in the direction you're moving, which is vital with such limited screen real estate. In general, scrolling also looks a fair bit smoother on original Game Boy. It moves at an even cadence in all directions, while on Game Boy Color, diagonal scrolling is noticeably jerky as the background shifts in varying pixel increments per frame. Also interesting is how within interior areas on GBC, the screen scrolls with Conker, which causes some jank on doors and other objects. Whereas in the Game Boy version, we've got single screen rooms with quick Zelda-style scrolling when you reach the edge, which looks much cleaner. One mark against the monochrome version for sure though, is that the slingshot windup is super slow. It takes 19 frames, just over 1 second from the start of the animation until the shot appears, and it feels kinda bad. That one quirk aside, I feel like the original Game Boy version is a bit more technically sound and playable, which is not at all what I would have guessed for this one before diving in. Although from what I've had time to play so far, it's a pretty flawed game no matter which version you play, but I could see myself getting kinda into it just as a fan of the developer. I really cannot guess the reason for why this game, or games plural really, are the way that they are, and it fascinates me. Super Game Boy support consists of a border with birthday balloons and various palettes that change with the environments. This is a super minor nitpick, but I couldn't help but notice that the brown palette region for the HUD is just 1 pixel shorter than the HUD itself, making the tips of the health icons the same color as the gameplay region. Lastly, I want to look at a game that skirts the criteria for this episode, but I was determined to include anyway. I 100%ed Donkey Kong Country 3 for Super Nintendo on a rental shortly after its release, so I couldn't justify buying my own copy for full price at the time. As a stopgap, I bought Donkey Kong Land 3 on Game Boy instead. Sure, Donkey Kong Land 2 and 3 are mostly just watered-down alternatives to their 16-bit counterparts, but since I am extremely familiar with the SNES games, I do enjoy these as a way to re-experience the feeling of being surprised by what's up ahead in some of my all-time favorite platformers in a form that is just different enough to keep me on my toes. But Japan never got that version. Instead, in 2000, Japan and only Japan got a Game Boy Color version. It's called Donkey Kong GB, Dinky Kong, and Dixie Kong. That's right, Dinky Kong. And it is a Game Boy Color exclusive, which is why I saved this one for last. There is no dual mode cart of this game. It's either the 1997 version from before the Game Boy Color existed, or the Japanese version that is incompatible with pre-colored Game Boys. So this time, it's separate carts, different ROMs, but still basically the same game. I don't care what anyone says, the 16-bit DKC games are still beautiful, especially on a CRT or with CRT effects. But admittedly, 8-bit systems, particularly a monochromatic 8-bit system, has never been where the style makes the best impression. However, Rare certainly made some strides since the first Donkey Kong Land in terms of generally keeping the backgrounds cleaner so that the gameplay is more legible on a tiny blurry LCD. Super Game Boy support includes a border, a colorized title screen, sectioned off palettes for the lives counter and backup character on the HUD, and palettes that change per location. Some palettes are decent, while others are not particularly appealing, so on the whole, I'd say that the Super Game Boy features here are rather phoned in. As for the Japanese Game Boy Color version then, well, unlike what Rare did with Conker, the underlying assets are almost all exactly the same as the original release. There are some minor color flourishes, such as the subtle shading gradient inside the redwood trees that adds a tiny touch of additional depth, but on the whole, this is a pretty straightforward GBC conversion. Single screen locations like the Brothers Bear cabins or Wrinkly's Save Cave didn't look great on original Game Boy to begin with, and I can't say that the addition of color does them any favors. In fact, while Wrinkly still animates on GBC, the Brothers Bear does not, a limitation that also extends to world map animations. The cutting room floor notes that this is because the GBC version prototype was built for a smaller ROM size, although the final shipping cartridge could have supported it. The world map also presents some of the game's more noticeable issues with color limitations across background tiles. That said, I think the colorization of the actual side-scrolling levels is on the whole very successful. It is of course a far cry from the SNES game that these tile sets are inspired by, but by and large, color tiling is handled in a way that presents relatively few artifacts. While the sprites for Dixie and Kitty, or excuse me, Dinky Kong, look a bit weird being monolithically tan without any clothing colors, it's about the best you could expect given the hardware constraints. While the monochrome presentation is fine, I find it hard to say it has many benefits here, and in general the GBC makes it even easier to read the level design, tell what's what, and follow the action. In addition, while slowdown isn't a major problem on original Game Boy, it absolutely is noticeably reduced on Game Boy Color. So on the whole, in spite of the colorization being hacked into a game that wasn't designed for it and the lack of revamped art to support it, as tasteful of a result as you could hope for given the hardware and visual style was nonetheless achieved, and I'd say it's clearly the better version over original Game Boy. I tested quite a few other games and was consistently surprised by the varied approaches during this weird transitional era of Game Boy. Like in Pocket Bomberman, which features some menus that I think look considerably nicer on Super Game Boy than they do on Game Boy Color. Or Bomberman Quest, which looks great on GBC, aside from the way that they use tiles for bombs, causing them to be in a stark white box, which isn't quite as obvious of an issue on regular Game Boy or Super Game Boy. That's to say nothing of the total lack of Pokemon in this episode, but I'd never finish if I did everything I wanted to do. And I hope I didn't come across as being too hard on the Game Boy Color. I have to admit, when I got it on Christmas Day in 1998, I was immediately disappointed by the lack of support for Super Game Boy enhanced palettes, and the lack of an interface for creating custom palettes like you can do on Super Game Boy. So I guess I've never fully forgiven it for setting a precedent for worse color support for those earlier titles, which carried forward to the GBA, Virtual Console, and even today to Nintendo Switch Online. It is a great machine, of course, but games like Link's Awakening, which knocked the colorization out of the park from the get-go and regrettably only had time for a passing mention here, well, games that go from monochrome to color with so few caveats like that are not necessarily the norm. I don't think that the Game Boy Color platform, either the actual system or backwards compatible or emulated implementations of it, necessarily represents the definitive best way to play all of the games it supports. For the black carts, that may often be the case, but I hope I've shown that you shouldn't always make that assumption. Don't forget that the monochrome presentation and Super Game Boy features are there too, and they are very much worth a look.